So good morning. This is VBS Lunch and Learn. A little bit late, I'm sorry, but Rabbi Feinstein here. Nice to have all of you with us, and hope that you're having a very pleasant Hanukkah and a really, a good springtime here. It's about 80 degrees outside here in Southern California, where we celebrate fall with this kind of temperature. So it's really good to have everybody here. Today, what we're going to do is look at, we're going to continue our conversation about the Ketuvim, about the closing books of the Hebrew Bible. And I had intended today to take on the book of Shir HaShirim, Song of Songs, which is a sexy love poem. Because after 3 days of turkey and stuffing, well, who isn't in the mood for romance, right? But I think what we're going to do instead is we're going to jump over Shir HaShirim. I promise we'll come back to it soon. And I want to do a different book of the Bible. I want to do the book of Daniel, because it has a very close connection to the Maccabees and to the story of Hanukkah. So if you'll permit me that sort of diversion, we'll do this together. So the book of Daniel is a book at the very end of the Hebrew Bible. It is chronologically the last book added to the Hebrew Bible. It was added to the Hebrew Bible just before the Maccabean Revolt. The Maccabean Revolt was in 166 BCE. So if you imagine about 170, 172 BCE is when this book was finally composed, edited, and added to the Hebrew Bible. It's a very strange book because it's two books. It's a book. The first 6 chapters are a set of stories about a fellow named Daniel, a Jewish fellow, who was taken into exile when Nebuchadnezzar conquered Jerusalem and becomes part of the Babylonian court. So chronologically, it's written in about 170 BCE, but it's about events. It retrojects those events back to about 586 BCE, about 400 years before, okay? So you're telling a story that happened 400 years earlier, which is an advantage, you see, because if you put the story in that time frame, then you can have all kinds of prophecy that happens to come true, you see. And then the second half of the book, which is chapters 7 through 12, are apocalyptic eschatology. The word apocalyptic means revelation. It's going to reveal to us an idea of what the future is going to be. It's a very strange, symbolic prophecy about what's going to happen at the end of days. The first half of the book is written in Hebrew. The second half of the book is written in Aramaic. And that's what makes the book so strange. So let's catch up with the history so everybody can keep the history in their head. And this is important for Hanukkah as well. And you'll see what the connection is in just a moment. So King David lives in about 1000 BCE, 1000 before the year 0. King David unites the tribes of Israel under one federal government, creates a federal army, uses that army to push back the borders of Israel and create a secure kingdom, a united kingdom of all of the tribes of Israel. David turns over the kingdom to his son Solomon in the year 930 BCE, and Solomon builds the Holy Temple of Jerusalem and expands the boundaries of the Israelite kingdom. Now, the reason why Solomon and David were so successful in expanding the boundaries of the Israelite kingdom was because the two great empires that characterized the ancient Near East, the empire of Mesopotamia, Iraq, to the north and west and east of us, and the empire of Egypt to the south and west of us were both in quiescence. They were both very quiet. They weren't very powerful at the time. There was a lot of internal rivalry. And because of the internal rivalries in those two empires, we could build a kingdom in this spot between the two. Because it turns out that the most important piece of real estate in the ancient world was the highway that connected Mesopotamia to Egypt. And guess who lives on that highway? That's right. The one place in the world where God put us was the most dangerous place in the ancient world. Now, the cultural advantage of living on that highway is distinct because we could absorb the cultures of those two places. Abraham is a Mesopotamian. Moses is an Egyptian, and we absorb the best of the cultures of those two areas of the world. The problem is that as soon as empire begins to rise again in the 8th century BCE, in the 700s BCE, we are living in ground zero. And sure enough, the first great empire, the northern Iraqi or northern Mesopotamian empire of Assyria, Ashur, rises up, comes across the Fertile Crescent, down the highway, encounters the northern kingdom of Israel, which tried to resist. The northern kingdom of Israel is smashed in 722. Then the Assyrians come to Jerusalem. Jerusalem surrenders. They sack the temple, take away all of its treasures, but they leave the kingdom intact. Assyria falls, and its place is taken by the second great Mesopotamian empire, Babylon. Babylon today is Baghdad. The Babylonians do the same thing. They come across the Fertile Crescent. They come to Jerusalem. Jerusalem surrenders. They put in place a vassal king. They go to war with Egypt. They come back. The vassal king is still there. 10 years, the Babylonians ruled Jerusalem. And then the Jerusalemites get this crazy idea that they could ally with Egypt and fight back against the Babylonians. So they declare their independence. They kill the governor. They declare war on the Babylonians, thinking that the Egyptians will back them. The Egyptians bail out. They do not back us. The Babylonians come. And in 586 BCE, they destroy Jerusalem and they take away its kingdom. They take away its leading citizens. This is the way that you pacified an empire. You took away its leading citizens, and they take away the leading citizens of Jerusalem, the priests, the kingdom, the king and his court, the leading merchants and thinkers and all the important folks, and they settle them by the waters of Babylon, where they sat and they wept. Well, not for long, because what happens at that point is quite remarkable. They didn't disappear. They were supposed to disappear. In fact, that's if you read that Psalm, the 137th Psalm, it says, by the waters of Babylon, there we sat, and there we wept, and we hung our lyres on the trees. And the Babylonians came and said, sing us a song of Zion. Sing us one of your Jewish songs. And the Judeans who were in exile in Babylon write in the Psalm, how can we sing a song of Jerusalem here on foreign soil? They figured it out. That's the interesting part. They figured it out. And they create something which is brand new to any ancient civilization, but an important idea for us Jews, the idea of diaspora. Now think of that word for a minute. Diaspora means I recognize that I am not at home. Somewhere else is my home. But I am going to preserve my identity and create an identity here far away from home. Now, theoretically, you're not allowed to do that. Theoretically, land, language, custom, way of life all go together, and you take out some of those elements. You take a people off of its land. You take it away from its culture. You take it away from its institutions. You put it in a place where people speak a different language, and you're supposed to disappear. But you Jews, you're stubborn. And there in diaspora, there by the waters of Babylon, Jews began to create the first diaspora Jewish culture. Now, diaspora Jewish culture presents an issue which living in your own land and your own sovereignty doesn't present. The question of how do you live as a cultural minority when there's a cultural majority with a whole different way of living life? You'll recognize that question because that has been the question of Jewish life ever since. Even going back to Israel, that's the Jewish question ever since. We are a cultural minority. The rest of the world eats differently than we do, dresses differently than we do, acts differently, thinks differently, listens to different music, worships gods different than ours. How do we maintain our cultural identity as a cultural minority? This is the classic diaspora question. And the classic diaspora question becomes acute when you begin to assimilate elements from the outside culture. Because the question is, what can I assimilate that strengthens my inner identity? And what is it that I assimilate that's toxic, that's poisonous to my identity? How much can I assimilate? What can I assimilate that will strengthen my identity? And where are the red lines that beyond which you can't go that will destroy that identity? And what does it mean to have an identity, to be separate from the folks outside and to live a different kind of life than they live? These are the great questions of diaspora Jewish identity and culture. And these, ironically, are the great questions that animate the Hanukkah holiday. And they're the questions that animate us. We live as a cultural minority in a cosmopolitan, pluralistic culture here in America. We adopt lots of things from that culture which have strengthened us. But the question is, what are the things that don't strengthen us? I'll give you a quick example. I was thinking about this with my wife. So we're driving around Encino, and there's lots of houses, even in my own neighborhood, where people have put up blue and white lights and decorated the front lawn with giant blow-up dreidels. Okay? Now, you could say this is a ripoff of the Christmas holiday, and it's illegitimate. But on the other hand, maybe it's not. Maybe this is a good way to help Jewish kids identify that we also celebrate, but we celebrate differently than our neighbors, right? When I was a kid in school, my mother was very clear that we were not going to have a Christmas tree, no matter how much we begged. But there were other Jewish kids I knew who had Christmas trees, and the argument was it's not religious, it's just decorative, it's not a sign of surrender to the outside culture, it's just something nice for the kinderlach. So why is a Christmas tree a problem, but blue and white lights are not? And by the way, if you get real antsy about this, if you have like real frum cousins who tell you that you're an assimilationist, ask them, what did Moses put on his latkes? I don't know if you know this, but latkes were not original to the Hanukkah story. The latkes weren't original to anything, right? So anyway, this becomes the great question. And this is something that we need to think about. And the reason why it becomes such an interesting question is because so the temple is destroyed, the population is brought back to Babylon, where they live by the waters of Babylon, and they build a culture for themselves. Babylon then falls to Persia. And the Persians decide it would be a good idea to let the Jews go back to Jerusalem and build their city, because it'll be a Persian colony and protect the western flank of the Persian Empire. So the Jews are permitted to go back and build the temple, and that's called the Second Temple. But the interesting thing is, not many went. Not many went, because once you've settled by the waters of Babylon or in Persia, you learned how to like it. And from then on, there's always going to be a diaspora Jewish community that's going to make its peace with the communities in which it lives. And what happens is that we have Jews who stay first in Babylon and then in Persia. That's what the book of Esther is all about. The book of Esther is about Jews who decided to stay in Shushan. And the book of Esther, as we looked earlier in the year, is all about how do you survive that diaspora? How do you survive politically in a diaspora that threatens your existence? This book of Daniel is going to be a similar question. Let's go a little farther. So first there's Assyria, then there's Babylon, then there's Persia. And then in 332 BCE, a Greek king by the name of Alexander the Great conquers the world, and Greek culture comes our way. And Greek culture washes across the Mediterranean. The entire Mediterranean begins to speak Greek. The entire Mediterranean begins to trade according to Greek maritime and mercantile law. The entire Mediterranean builds cities according to Greek forms. And the great question that's going to come to Judea, it's a question that the Hanukkah holiday is built around, is how much of that Greek culture can we make our own before we give up our Jewishness? That is the question of Hanukkah. That's the great question of Hanukkah. Now, what happens there, the drama of the Hanukkah story, is that you have a class of Jews who occupied Jerusalem, who are keen on becoming as Greek as they can as quickly as possible. And so they call in help from the king, the Greek king in Syria. The capital of the Syrian Greek Empire is Antioch. And so the king is called Antiochus. And Antiochus sends a Zeus statue to install in the temple of Jerusalem. And that launches the Maccabean revolt against that. Because the Maccabees were okay if you were speaking Greek. The Maccabees were okay if you wanted to begin living a sort of Greek life. But the moment you install a statue of Zeus, you bring idolatry to the temple. The moment you compromise Jewish monotheism, that was the line the Maccabees couldn't cross. And that initiates the Maccabean War. The book of Daniel was written just before that. The book of Daniel was written as this move toward Hellenization was happening. This move toward assimilating into the Greek world is happening as the king is beginning to push upon the Jews to advance their assimilation into Greek culture. Now, the first half of the book of Daniel is a parable, is a set of stories that are going to sound very familiar to you. Very, very familiar to you. So let's take a look together. Before we start, any questions so far? We doing okay so far? This was all background. That was all background. A lot of background, but you needed to hear it. So, okay, let's take a look. The book of Daniel begins by introducing us to this character. So in the third year of King Jehoiakim of Judah, King Nebuchadnezzar came to Jerusalem, laid siege, and he basically conquers them, right? And he takes away all of the Israelites. The king ordered his chief officer to bring some Israelites of royal descent and of nobility, youths without blemish, handsome, proficient in wisdom, knowledge, intelligent, capable of serving in the royal palace, and teach them the language and writing of the Chaldeans. The king allotted rations, etc. And there are the names and one of them is this boy named Daniel. So Nebuchadnezzar, according to this book, conquers Jerusalem, brings the populace to Babylon, and then says to his chief officer, go and find me some of the brightest Jewish kids. I want to train them to join my National Security Council. And among them is this genius, this young genius, whose name is Daniel. Okay? And now these are the adventures of Daniel in the court of King Nebuchadnezzar. Here's the first big story. There's 5 stories or 6 stories. Here's the first one, actually 5. Here's the first one. In the second year of the reign of Nebuchadnezzar, he had a dream. His spirit was agitated. He was overcome by sleep. So he ordered all of his magicians and exorcists and sorcerers to be summoned and tell him what he dreamed. So usually when a king has a dream, he wants to know, like, what does it mean? It's an omen from beyond. This king has an interesting idea. He wants to do better. He says to the magicians, you're all magicians, right? You're all mind readers, you're psychics, you're sorcerers. Tell me my dream and then tell me what it means. And the magicians say, no, we can't do that. Tell us the dream and we'll tell you what it means. And they say, no. If you're really a magician, you should be able to tell me what my dream was, right? My brothers have this, or my kids actually have this funny thing. These people on Ventura Boulevard who advertise themselves as psychics. You ever see these people? So he says, look to see if they have a doorbell. If they have a doorbell, they're no psychic, right? Who's there? You tell me. So he says to them, and the magicians all say, we can't tell you what your dream is. Only you know what your dream is. And he says, you're all false magicians. I'm going to put you to death. And Daniel happens to be one of them. Right? So here's the story. When the decree condemning the wise men to death was issued, Daniel and his companions were about to be put to death. When Daniel remonstrated, he talked to Arioch, the captain of the royal guard, who was sent to put all these guys to death. And he said, why is the decree so urgent? Why is he doing this? And he told them. So Daniel went to ask the king for time that he might tell the meaning to the king. And he went to his house and he informed his companions, these are the names of the companions, they might implore God of heaven for help regarding the mystery, right? And then Daniel speaks up and he says, let the name of God be blessed forever, for wisdom and power are his. Thereupon, Daniel went to Arioch, whom the king had appointed to do away with the wise men, and said, do not do away with the wise men. Bring me to the king. I will tell the king what his dream was. Does this sound familiar to anybody? They're riffing on a story. What story are they riffing on? Come on. Go ahead. I can't hear you. Speak up. Speak up. Speak up. Speak up. Douglas, you got to unmute.
Joseph. What
right.
we're reading this week in the Torah.
Exactly. It's the Joseph story. And the Joseph story happens to be the story that you read during the week of Hanukkah. Now, think about this for just a minute. There's actually two ways you can understand this. Number one is the Joseph story, the wise Jewish boy brought into the court of Pharaoh to interpret his dreams and give him wisdom. And every time he gives him wisdom, he says, it's not from me, it's from God. The other way to think about this is Esther in the court of Ahasuerus. You'll see that theme here played out. Now, why is Esther in the court of Ahasuerus and Pharaoh and Joseph in the court of Pharaoh? Why are these important stories? Because they're stories about how we Jews are going to survive diaspora. Remember, in this telling, Nebuchadnezzar has just destroyed Jerusalem, right? So what is he telling him? You're not going to survive through military power. You're not going to survive by fighting back against these empires. We Jews are never going to have enough power to fight back against empire. The power that we Jews possess is the power of wisdom given to us by God. The rabbis did the exact same thing to the Hanukkah story, right? The Hanukkah story, if you read it in the book of Maccabees, which is the book that Simon Maccabee wrote for his children's children to tell them how the Maccabees came into power. The book of Maccabees talks about the great miracle of the Maccabees' military victory against Antiochus and against the forces of the Hellenizers in Jerusalem. But by the time the rabbis got hold of the holiday 300 years later, they changed the holiday. And the most evident moment of the change of the holiday, the most evident evidence of that is the Haftorah that we're going to read on Shabbos. The Haftorah we're going to read on Shabbos comes from a very obscure prophet named Zechariah. And the most important line in that Haftorah is a line that our friend Debbie Friedman made into a song. Lo b'chayil v'lo b'koach im beruchi amar Adonai. Not by might and not by power, but by spirit alone, says God. Now think about that a minute. What is he saying? We Jews are going to survive not because we're stronger militarily than anybody, because we're not. We're not. That's not our gift. That's not our way of surviving. That's not Jewish power. What is Jewish power? Jewish power is wisdom. And we can share that wisdom with the world. And using our wisdom shared with the world, we can survive. That's the image of Daniel in the court of Nebuchadnezzar. And it's the image of Joseph in the court of Pharaoh. And it's the image of Esther in the court of Ahasuerus. It's a very interesting statement about what Jewish power really is. Now you can see there's another level of this. And let's put this on the table as well. The rise of empire, the rise of empire in the rise of empire, first Assyria, then Babylon, then Persia, then Greece, then Rome, then the Byzantines, then the Christians, then the Muslims, presented the Jewish people with a terrible case of cognitive dissonance. Cognitive dissonance is when you're presented with two truths which are not compatible, two facts which are not compatible. What are the two facts? On the one hand, we see ourselves as the chosen people of the God of the universe. On the other hand, we are militarily marginal, politically peripheral, and we have no real power even to control the conditions of our own existence. So what do you do if you're facing that kind of a cognitive dissonance? Well, one of the ways that you can do that is you can assert that the prevalence of these empires, the preeminence of these empires, is in fact God's will. That this really is all God, that God really still is the preeminent actor in history. And we are the ones who can read that. We are the ones who can understand that. And that is part of what this book of Daniel and what Joseph in Pharaoh's court and what Esther in Ahasuerus' court is all about. After all, what does Joseph tell Pharaoh? Remember what Joseph tells Pharaoh? It's this week's Torah portion, right? God has sent you a dream. There are going to be 7 good years and 7 bad years, and here's how you deal with it. Now think about what that means. He's telling Pharaoh, you may be the king of Egypt, and you may think that you're God, but you're not. You don't control the universe. The God who does control the universe has decreed this, and all you can do is respond. And it's a good thing you have a smart Jew in your court, because that's the only way that you're going to learn how to respond. I mean, think of the dynamic of that story. It's a brilliant story. And here you have the exact same story. So what happens is Daniel says to the king, you may be King Nebuchadnezzar, the great emperor of Babylon, but you're just one in a long series of kings who come and go. We're the ones who stick around because we know how to do something which you can't do. We can read history and understand it. The interpretation of a dream is an interpretation of the signs and the patterns of history. That's what the interpretation of a dream is all about. So here is Nebuchadnezzar's dream as told by Daniel, right? The king says to Daniel, can you really make known to me the dream I saw and its meaning? Daniel answers the king, the mystery about which the king has inquired, wise men, exorcists, magicians cannot tell the king, but there is a God in heaven who reveals mysteries. And he, God, has made known to Nebuchadnezzar what is to be at the end of days. This is your dream that entered your mind, right? O king, the thoughts that came to your mind in your bed are of future events. Right. And he's revealed mysteries, has let you know what is to happen, not because my wisdom is greater than other creature, has the mystery revealed to me, but in order that the meaning should be made to know to the king, and you may know the thoughts of your mind. And in order that you may understand that you better be good to the Jews, because we're the only people who understand this language, right? So here's the king's dream. You ready? King, as you looked on, there appeared a great statue. The statue, which was huge and its brightness surpassing, stood before you, and its appearance was awesome. The head of the statue was of gold, of fine gold. Its breast and arms were of silver. Its belly and thighs of bronze. Its legs were of iron. Its feet, part iron, part clay. And as you look on, a stone was hewn out, not by hands, and struck the statue on the feet of iron and clay and crushed them. And all at once, the whole thing came tumbling down. That's the dream. Anybody ever hear the English expression, feet of clay? You ever hear of that expression? This is where it comes from. This is where it comes from. Now, what does it mean? He says, here's the statue. The statue is a physical representation of history. The golden head of the statue, that's you, Nebuchadnezzar. The silver breast of the statue, that's the Emperor Darius, who's going to depose you. The iron part, the iron part of the statue, the bronze part of the statue, that's its legs. That's the Persian Emperor Cyrus, who's going to depose Darius. And the feet, which are clay and iron, are the generals of this, are the kings of the Seleucid and Ptolemaic empires, the Greeks who rule in Antioch and in Alexandria, who can't make an alliance. And what is the great stone? This great stone is going to come and knock the whole thing down. That's God's will. That's what God's going to do. You kings, you rise up and you think that you're so great. God is the only actor in history. And we Jews are the only ones who can read that history. And then, of course, the king swears his allegiance to the God of Israel, which is a completely Jewish fantasy. right? It's a completely Jewish fantasy. It's just, and that's what, and Nebuchadnezzar becomes this sweetheart of a guy, this pussycat of a guy who protects Jewish life. Complete fantasy of the Bible. Okay. So far, so good. That's one that gives you a sense of what the book is. Let's take a look at another chapter of the book. Shall we do that? Is that okay? Okay. So let's take a look at chapter 5, which is another story parallel to the one we just read, but it's even more fun. Okay. And I want to just do one quick thing here before we do this. There, good. Okay, can everybody see this?
Yes.
Belshazzar is the king who succeeds. It's the son of Nebuchadnezzar. So we're going to jump ahead a whole generation. Daniel is still working as a national security advisor for the Babylonian emperors. Now we get Belshazzar, who is the stupid son of Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar, who acknowledged the greatness of God, the God of Israel, and became a protector of Jewish life. Belshazzar, stupid son who inherited his father's business, right? Belshazzar gave a great banquet for his 1,000 nobles. That sound familiar? It sounds like just the beginning of the book of Esther, right? And in the presence of the thousands, he drank wine. Sounds like Ahasuerus, right? It's exactly a ripoff of Ahasuerus. Under the influence of the wine, Belshazzar ordered the gold and silver vessels that his father Nebuchadnezzar had taken out of the temple of Jerusalem to be brought so that the king and his nobles and his consorts and his concubines could drink from them. The golden vessels that had been taken out of the sanctuary of the house of God in Jerusalem were brought, and the king and his nobles and his consorts and his concubines drank for them. They drank wine and praised the gods of silver and gold and bronze and iron and wood and stone. So what's the story? Belshazzar, the stupid son of Nebuchadnezzar, is having a wine feast with all of his prostitute girlfriends, right? And his buddies. And he orders that the holy vessels of the temple of Jerusalem that had been taken from Jerusalem and cared for by Nebuchadnezzar be brought out and used for serving for the party. In other words, a gross, horrifying blasphemy, even for an idolatrous pagan king, because you don't disrespect a local cult. You don't do that. You don't disrespect. And he's not using the vessels for any kind of sacred purpose. He's using them for a secular wine feast, for some kind of wine celebration. And all of a sudden, in the middle of this feast, what happens, right? All of a sudden, just then, the fingers of a human hand appeared and wrote on the plaster of the wall of the king's palace opposite the lampstand, so that the king could see the hand as it wrote. This is worthy of Spielberg, right? The king is having this party, he's drunk, and all of a sudden a disembodied hand shows up and starts writing on the wall.
The hand of God.
The hand of God. This is great stuff. The king's face darkened. No shoot, right? And his thoughts alarmed him. The joints of the loins were loosened, meaning he's pissing in his pants, and his knees knocked together. The king called loudly for exorcists, Chaldeans, and diviners to be brought. He keeps doing this, right? And the king addressed the wise men of Babylon. Whoever can read the writing and tell me its meaning shall be clothed in purple and wear a golden chain on his neck and shall rule as one of 3 in the kingdom. The king's wise men came, but they could not read the writing or make known its meaning to the king. And he grew exceedingly alarmed, and his face darkened. Again, ever hear the English phrase, reading the writing on the wall? This is where it comes from. Now, think of that as a metaphor for just a minute, right? What does it mean to read the writing on the wall? It means to be able to see the events of your day and see what they really mean, to see past the appearances down to the depths and see what events are really happening, what's really happening in history. Pharaoh couldn't do it. He couldn't read the dream. Nebuchadnezzar couldn't read the dream. Achashverosh was drunk all the time. And here we have Belshazzar, and he can't read the writing on the wall. So he calls all of his sorcerers and all of his magicians and all of his exorcists, all of them, and all the wise men of Babylon, and they can't read it either. And he's alarmed because he knows this is a sign from a power greater than himself. Just to give you a sense of this, this is Rembrandt. Rembrandt did a midrash on this one, right? Rembrandt, who read the Bible because he lived in the Jewish neighborhood of Amsterdam. So this is his vision of it. Look at the way this piece is put together. Just artistically, it's absolutely brilliant. Here's Belshazzar, the emperor of Babylon, wearing this beautiful royal golden dress, you see, with fur. And he's got the crown balanced on his head with this amazing turban here. But look at the expression on his face. Look at the contrast between the composition of his dress, how incredibly beautiful it is, and the look of sheer terror and alarm on his face, right? And here you get the concubines, right? You get these like sleazy concubines. You get this fellow over here, Captain Ahab over here. There's one back here you can't quite see. You see the back of this woman, right? And everyone is looking. Here are the golden vessels from the holy temple being, and they're being poured out because there's such a sense of alarm. And here is the disembodied hand, and here are the words. And I'll show you the words. Rembrandt actually got this right, but you have to read it vertically, not horizontally. It's Mem Nun Aleph Mana, Mem Nun Aleph Mana twice, Taf Kuf Lamed Takel. Ufrasin, okay? It's not Hebrew, it's Aramaic. It's Aramaic. But this is such a beautiful composition. If you look at the way it's set, it's the letters are behind him, so he has to turn around in this sort of strange way. In other words, he can't look forward. He doesn't have the ability to even see what's there, okay? Let's come back to the text now. So here's what's going to happen. I know you want to know what's going to happen, right? So they bring Daniel in because none of the guys can figure it out, right? You are Daniel, one of the exiles of Judah, whom my father, the king, brought from Judah. I've heard about you, that you have the spirit of the gods in you and an illumination, knowledge, extraordinary wisdom to be found in you. Now the wise men have been brought before me. They can't read the writing. Help me. And if you can, I'll give you all this gold. And Daniel says, keep your gifts, schmuck, and keep your presents. I'll read it for you, right? He said, King, most high God bestowed kingship, grandeur, glory upon your father. And because of the grandeur he bestowed, all the people and the nations of every language trembled in fear of him. He put to death those he wished. He wished to let live. He raised high whom he wished to raise high, and he brought low he wanted to raise low. But when he grew haughty and willfully presumptuous, he was deposed from his royal throne and his glory removed from him. You think you are God. You are not. You think you have all the power. You do not. You are a vessel of divine power of the God of Israel. And it's only when the God of Israel decides you rule, you rule. And when God's had enough of you, you ain't ruling no more. He was driven away from men. You, Belshazzar, you did not humble yourself, although you knew all of this. You exalted yourself against the Lord of heaven. Now, I mean, the chutzpah of Daniel to say this to the emperor who could have him killed in an instant with a bat of the eye, right? And then he tells him, here is the meaning of the words that you read, right? Mana, mana, takel, ubsharin, right? This is the meaning. Mana from the word mana. Moneh in Hebrew means to count. It means to count. God has numbered the days of your kingdom and brought it to an end. Takel. Takel means to weigh something. You've been weighed in the balance and found wanting. Ufrasin, your kingdom has been divided and given to the Medes. That's the Persians who are coming, and the Persians after them, right? That is the meaning of the remarkable scene. In other words, you don't rule the world. You can't read the writing on the wall. You can't figure this out. And the book of Daniel is this wonderful story that it's a play on the Joseph story, and it's a play on the Esther story. But it's an interesting story about what gives us power in the world. Where is power truly vested in the world? And the idea that there are patterns in history. And if you can read the patterns in history, you can rule. But if you don't have the ability to read the patterns in history, if your eyes are closed, if you're just terrified, you can't read the writing on the wall, then nothing in the world can save you. And that the gift of the Jewish people is not material power, not military power, but the ability to read the writing on the wall. Hey, let's stop a second. Anyone, questions, comments, counter sermons? Yes, Douglas, please.
Well, the first question I have is all the three stories, Joseph, Esther, and Daniel, all require as a prerequisite access to the highest echelons of power.
Right.
You can't be a regular nudnik. Well, most of Jewish history were in shtetls, and we don't have that access.
Well, that's actually not true. We actually did have access in many cases. Well, because
in instances, but many instances we didn't, right?
Yes, that's true. In some instances we did, in some we didn't. In medieval and early modern Europe, Jews provided the material. The Jews were the merchants that lent money to the kings and provided all of their provisions. You couldn't go to war without a Jewish banker. Which made Jewish life more precarious, because once everybody in the kingdom had built up enough debt to the Jews, it was in their interest to throw the Jews out of the country, right? But in many cases, if you think about the Jews in Muslim and Christian Spain, we have a central role there. So in some cases, we did have control. But you're right. The idea here is you have to, in order to play a role in history, you have to get close to those who do have material power. But the gift that you have is your capacity to read the writing on the wall, your capacity to interpret history, interpret events, and bring a quality of wisdom that they lack, that you have, but that they lack.
And where are we getting this wisdom?
What? Oh, from God. It's a gift of God. That's the point. It's a gift of God. You don't like the story, huh? All right. I think it's fun, right? It raises, by the way, a really, really interesting question about Zionism, which was, in fact, a return to material power in the world, and whether that really is the place to invest for the future of the Jewish people long term. Really interesting question, right? But you're right. All right, who's next? Someone else had a question? Yes, Stanley.
I think the story is great. And I want to mention that's actually the Jews had power in Amsterdam. And it was Rembrandt, right, who knew the Jewish rabbis there and made many paintings with a lot of Jewish interpretation in them. So
yeah, if you've ever been to Amsterdam, you can visit Rembrandt's house and you realize that his house is a block down from the synagogue. Hang on one second. I got to take yours.
I love that picture. Let me see if I can get it on my phone.
Sorry. His house is a block down from the synagogue. So it's not inconceivable. I mean, partly Rembrandt is a religious man, but it's also not inconceivable that he's just sitting in his front yard smoking his pipe, asking the people coming home from shul one Hanukkah, what did the rabbi talk about? And the rabbi talked about this book of Daniel, because this book of Daniel is about reading the writing on the wall, reading history. And it's written at a time when the Jews are experiencing one empire after another, right? First Assyria, then Babylon, then the Medes, then the Persians, now the Greeks, then the Romans. And they're coming to this conclusion that this is the way that we're going to deal with this. This is a parable about Jewish survival, but it's also a theory of history that enables us to go on believing and holding our identity, the identity of how we see ourselves. And that, I think, these are the important elements of this. I just love this picture because it really captures the emotions of the moment.
But Rembrandt did know a rabbi down the street.
And he knew a lot of them.
Right. Anyway, I think
Famous
it's great.
painting of the Jews sleeping during the rabbi's sermon. I don't know if you've ever seen it. It's in one of the museums in Europe. Let's see. Ed Shackman, how are you, sir?
I'm fine, thank you. I'm trying to relate the spirituality that's trying to be developed as to what our real strength is and the wisdom. And I'm trying to relate that to the 6-Day War and the Yom Kippur War. You know, that was more than just, I mean, it had to be more than just wisdom, right?
Well, that's why I said that's why this theory is a diaspora theory of Judaism. And it's a diaspora theory of Judaism that the early Zionist fathers and mothers basically rejected, right? What was Zionism all about? Zionism perceived that Jews in diaspora had grown so accustomed to their powerlessness that it corrupted them, that it turned them from active to passive people who couldn't protect themselves, who couldn't stand up for themselves, who didn't even try. I mean, what's the great, they didn't even try. And the idea that they waited for Messiah. And at a certain point, the Zionist fathers said, enough waiting for Messiah. We have to bring Messiah. We have to be Messiah. Right. And so they promulgate an alternative theory of Jewish history, an alternative theory of Jewish existence, where we take control of the material conditions of our own existence. We take power in the world, not just the power of wisdom, but the power of armies. And we heal the impotence and the powerlessness and the hopelessness and the helplessness of Jews by taking power again. The best song about this, guys, is Mia Malel, right? Mia Malel is a Zionist song, and it is a complete rejection of the traditional Jewish idea of where power lies, right? Because the Zionists went back and recovered the Maccabees. Why did they recover the Maccabees? Because the Maccabees war in 166 BCE is the last war we won before 1948. That's a long losing streak. That's almost as long as the Chicago Cubs, right? From 166 to 1948, no Jewish army won a war. And we gave up the idea of the warrior and adopted the idea of the scholar, of the pious one who prays and learns and waits for God to redeem us. And the Zionists came and said, enough with your waiting. Stand up and stand for yourself. So take a look at the words of this song, because I just think this is great. Hang on one second. Let me find my Hanukkah. Here's my Hanukkah sheet. Let's go there's my song. All right, wait 1 second. There we go. I happen to think this is actually, now that you mentioned it, here's the song. Can everybody see it?
Yeah.
Mi Malel Gvurot Yisrael Otan Mi Yimna Hein Bechal Dor Yakum Gibor Goel Ha'am. Written by Menashe Ravina, whose real name was Rabinowitz. He was a music student in Germany, came from Poland, went to Germany, studied music, made Aliyah to Israel. And in the 1930s, he wrote this song. Listen to the words. And he went to yeshiva as a kid, so he knew the Bible. Mi Malel Gvurot Yisrael. The line in the book of Psalms is, Mi Malel Gvurot Adonai. Who can count the glories of God? He says, no, it's Mi Malel Gvurot Yisrael, Otan Mi Yimneh. You see, the glories of Israel, not the glories of God. Hein Bechol Dor, in every generation, Yakum HaGibor, a hero will arise, Goel Ha'am, to redeem the people. In our prayer book, we have a blessing right after the song Michamocha, Baruch Atah Adonai, Goel Yisrael. God is the Goel. God is the Redeemer, not the Gibor. But the Zionists said, I'm not waiting for God to redeem us. We're going to be our own heroes, right? And now he really sticks it to the tradition. Ready? Shema. You've heard that word before. Bayam imahem bazman hazeh. That's taken literally from the bracha we said last night, and we'll say tonight, right? Maccabee. What are you doing? Come here. There's my dog. Maccabee, Moshiach Ufodeh. Moshiach, meaning savior, Fodeh, rescuer. Maccabee Moshiach Fodeh, not God. God is not Moshiach, right? Maccabee was the Moshiach. Uviamenu kolam Yisrael, and in our days let all of Israel, and now three verbs end the song, three infinitive verbs. Yitached, gather as one, from the word Shema, Echad, but this time it's not God who is Echad, it's we who are Echad. Yakum, we will rise up. Vayigael. For those of you who know a little bit of Hebrew, that's the Nifal future tense of the word Goel, meaning we will be redeemed. Or better, we will redeem ourselves. The Zionist theory was exactly the opposite of this. The Zionist theory was we will gain material power, we will build armies, and we will redeem ourselves, and we won't wait for God to do it anymore. So the book of Daniel, like the story of Joseph and the story of Esther, are diaspora stories. And it was exactly that story that the Zionist tradition rejected and gave us a different vision of our place in history. Now the question is, how do you reconcile these different theories of where we fit in history, and what really is the nature of Jewish power? And that's a question that our generation is debating right now. That really is what our generation is debating. And where is the spirituality of Jewish power if Jewish power goes back to being guns and tanks and planes and that kind of stuff, instead of the ability to read the writing on the wall? Here's the real interesting question, Ed. Once you gain real power again, like material power, do you lose the ability to read the writing on the wall?
That's the question.
Once you gain material power, do you forget how to read history? Because you're so hypnotized by the power that you gain that you forget what the real power of the Jewish people is. That really is the question that this book raises. And that's why it's such a great story for Hanukkah, don't you think? Can I add one more question? Please go ahead. Yes.
Yeah, that really is wisdom, to be wise and not lose your wisdom because you've gained the material power. That's the real answer to your question.
Right. And Hanukkah is a great case study in our failure to do this, because the Maccabees take independence from the Seleucid Greeks, and they ruled Jerusalem for 100 years, but they couldn't keep it up. They started fighting among themselves. They became corrupt. They became cruel. They became brutal. And the populace of Jerusalem said, enough of this, bring us the Romans. We'd rather live under Roman oppression with peace and civil order than live under the Maccabee corruption. So your point is exactly on target. Can you hold power and not lose your ability to read the writing on the wall? That is the great question. Andy, you get the last question today because I have to go eat lunch. This may be lunch and learn, and then Sandy gets one too.
Thanks.
Sorry,
I was just going to say that it was, it's not so much a question, just a statement. So be quick. And it's absolute power corrupts absolutely. And what we're seeing is when they have that power, it corrupts it so that they can't have the true balance.
Yeah.
If you have a balance, you're not corrupted because you have a check, your scales are leveled. But once you have absolute power on one side, you're corrupt. You can't see the other side.
The question is, why does power corrupt? That's the question. Why does power blind you?
It's absolute power. So what happens is when you master one,
yeah,
it totally corrupts you that you can't see the other one. It just does. It
overwhelms
you. It's the human psychic. I mean, it's just
right.
Who we are.
Perfect.
I don't know.
Go ahead.
It's our Congress, but that's not what I.
No, don't go there.
I'm not going there. No, what I really wanted to ask, I'm so sorry I missed Monday. You have no idea, because I just love when you teach. But where did money come into it? My gardener walked in and saw my table, and on the table is Hanukkah gelt and then chocolate. And Gelty said, why is there money? What does money have to do with Hanukkah? And I said, we played with dreidels. I didn't know what to say.
Yeah, the answer is there's a long answer and a short answer. The short answer is the Maccabees declare independence, and the symbol of their independence is they strike coins declaring the kingdom of Judea independent of the Seleucid Greeks, and the striking of coins as a symbol of Jewish independence, then gives you Hanukkah Geld. All right. The other answer is it was a custom this time of year in European communities to have certain kinds of parties with certain kinds of gambling. Dreidels were European gambling devices. As before slot machines were invented, you had dreidels, and this was European, and we simply assimilated that. Just like we assimilated presents for Hanukkah. There never was a custom of presents for Hanukkah. If you have friends who are Jews from South Africa or Latin America, they find the whole thing very strange. Jews gave a little bit of gelt, they had a little bit of fun, but they never gave presents. This was an American thing that we assimilated from Christmas. And even giving gifts at Christmas time was something that was largely promulgated by Macy's and Gimbels in New York. Right.
I had heard that they did it when they were studying Torah, and then when the governing classes would come in, we'd take out the
See, these are all wonderful stories that we made up to talk about why we stole a really kind of questionable European custom, right?
Okay, thank you.
Right, and I will end today with the most famous Christmas Jewish joke there is. In the early days of Macy's and Gimbels, they needed a Santa Claus for the department store. So where did you go to find men with long white beards? You went down to the Lower East Side, and they would recruit these guys. This is true, by the way. They recruited these guys to the Lower East Side to be Santa Claus. So Santa Claus is sitting in the middle of Macy's or Gimbels, pick your choice. And a little boy crawls up in his lap and he goes, ho, 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 Merry Christmas, my boy. What would you like from the North Pole? And the boy whispers into Santa's ear, Santa, it's no Christmas for me. I'm Jewish. We make Hanukkah. And Santa whispers back to the kid, a gesunden dein Kappel. Have a great holiday, everybody. Take care.
You. Very fast.
2 weeks. We'll be back. This is now the website for this for this Zoom. So I'll send it to you again, but it's the new